Conflict in Communication. Week 6, Verbal Communication. Understanding Language. So before I get started, I just wanted to say that the majority of the class voted to continue using the videos for this week, and I found that those who wanted to take a break were mainly concerned with the amount of new content that was being presented in the videos, as well as their overall length. So I kind of wanted to come up with a bit of a compromise. This is going to be a shorter video that sticks really close to the textbook. There's 4 sort of minor points I'm adding at the end, but I'm also going to be adding an additional chart that will cover those points, and I'll be posting that on Nexus. It's also going to follow very closely the free study guide that's available online. So I encourage those who don't have access to the textbook to please make sure that they download that study guide. So this video provides a brief overview of several key features of language that we can take into consideration when analyzing conflict in communication. By the end of this video, you should be able to list and describe the characteristics of language, list and describe the social functions of language, and list and describe barriers to effective verbal communication. Characteristics of language. So let's start with a few key definitions. So as I said, verbal communication is communication that involves language, and language is a simple system that uses words. So that would be why something like sign language would be considered a form of verbal communication, but something like this would not, because this is more of an ambiguous form of nonverbal communication. In particular, this could be considered something called an emblem, but we'll get to that next week. So again, something like sign language, that would be a form of verbal communication, but other forms of body language, giving a thumbs up, flashing a peace sign, these would not be considered a form of verbal communication. So again, language is a symbol system that uses words, and words are symbols that stand for things. And by things, we mean really concrete things like tables or computers, as well as more abstract things like love or communication itself. The textbook outlines 4 major characteristics of language. 1, it's symbolic. 2, it's rulebound. 3, it's culturebound. And 4, it's dynamic. Language is symbolic. So as I said, words are symbols that stand for things. And this textbook chapter introduces the Ogden and Richards triangle of meaning model to try to help explain the relationship between a word, which is the symbol, the referent, the thing it describes, and the meaning, the thought or thoughts that are associated with the word and the thing. So for example, let's take the phrase, "That's my cat," and let's focus on the word cat. So someone says, "That's my cat," and this walks up to you. This would be the reference. This is the thing that the word cat refers to. The symbol would be the word cat. The thoughts, though, could vary considerably, right? You may see this animal or hear the word cat and think, "Oh, cute," or you might think, "Ah, I have allergies." Another way that we can think about the meanings that we attach to words is through the definitions of denotative and connotative meanings. A denotative meaning is the literal or dictionary meaning of a word, and the connotative is the meaning which takes other contextual clues into account. For example, if we take this phrase, "That's my cat," the denotative or sort of regular dictionary definition would be a small, domesticated, carnivorous mammal with soft fur, a short snout, and retractable claws. But the connotative meaning really depends on lots of different factors, including our personal experiences, as well as the particular context within which that word is said. If someone says, "That's my cat," and we're, say, watching a cat about to be hit by a car, the meaning might be very different than, say, if we see someone that we don't like and they say, "Oh, that's my cat." Again, the meanings and thoughts that we might associate with the term are shaped by other contextual clues. Characteristic 2, language is rulebound. So basically, there are 4 general rules which help to govern how language is used. And this, of course, helps us to understand one another. All languages have phonological rules, which are rules that govern the sounds that appear in a language. So this deals with the issues around pronunciation. Syntactic rules, which are rules governing the arrangement of words and punctuation in a sentence, so the idea of sentence structure. Semantic rules, which are rules that relate to agreed upon meanings of words, and pragmatic rules, rules that take context into account when arriving at meaning. So it kind of shapes what interpretation of a given word would be considered reasonable in a given context. So what I encourage you to do now is to take a minute, pause the video, and consider the phrase, "Your assignment is late." And think about how phonological rules, syntactic rules, semantic rules, and pragmatic rules help us to actually understand this particular statement. Characteristic 3, language is culture bound. So this has to do with the interactions between language, culture, and perception. And in particular, the textbook offers two terms to help us understand this, the idea of linguistic determinism and linguistic relativity. Linguistic determinism is the idea that language determines our thinking, right? So this is the idea that language isn't just a way that we name things in our world, that the system of language within which we operate actually shapes and determines the way that we think about the world. So this connects to the idea of linguistic relativity, which again is the idea that people who speak different languages perceive and think about the world in different ways. Characteristic 4, language is dynamic. So this has to do with the way in which languages change, including things like the development of new words, changes in the way words are pronounced, and or changes to the sign, so changes to the word, the way that the word is actually formulated. So you can think about, for example, the differences in how the word color became Americanized and spelt differently, or how the word dough became a part of actually the English language dictionary. So those are the four main characteristics of language. It's symbolic, it's rule-bound, it's culture-bound, and it's dynamic. Social functions of language. How does language help us function as social beings in our world? There are three main ideas outlined in the textbook. 1, language allows us to construct and name our world. 2, language brings us together or separates us. 3, language conveys credibility to the user. Now, this particular section I interpret more as language can help to demonstrate and reinforce particular relationships of power. Language allows us to construct and name our world. This goes back to the idea that language is culture-bound. Language actually shapes how we perceive the world around us and actually carries systems of knowledge. Consider, for example, what happens when a language is lost. There are around under 7,000 or so languages in the world, but global linguistic diversity is decreasing as many languages are being impacted by factors such as globalization, demographic changes, and the intergenerational impact of colonization. Now, when a language is lost, we lose more than just words. We lose an entire way of looking at the world and relating to the world. And this is because language shapes how we perceive the world and actually carries systems of knowledge. The second point the textbook makes is this idea that language brings us together or separates us. So language is a way that we actually form in groups and out groups, right? Or how we differentiate between people who are like us and people who are not like us. And there's a couple of different ways that we do that. Convergence involves language practices that unite us. So this can be things like a shared language itself, or a shared sort of specialized language, like a particular academic discourse or vocabulary. And there's also other forms, like particular forms of insider talk, which the textbook refers to as restricted codes. So this would include things like inside jokes, or maybe pet names or nicknames that you have for other people. Of course, when we're creating groups like us, we also create groups not like us. So divergence includes language practices that emphasize differences between groups. So for example, the usage of slang can be a way that a particular group may sort of differentiate itself from another. The next point, language conveys credibility to the user. And I think this is a kind of a funny way to put this. And I think I see it more as this idea that language can help to demonstrate and reinforce different power relationships. So to understand that, we need to kind of walk through a few definitions. First, the textbook suggests that we all have our own conversational style. That is the way that we present and express ourselves when conversing with others. And this can include both verbal and nonverbal factors. Textbook further goes on to state that our conversation style conveys intentional and unintentional messages about who holds power and authority in a given relationship. And in particular, the textbook uses the term one up and one down to describe sort of relationships where there is a clear inequity in power. Now, I've been using the phrases higher power party and lower power party to describe a similar relationship. Now, the way in which this happens through the usage of language is through what the textbook calls either powerful or powerless language. And another word for powerless language is deferential language. In using powerful language in a given situation, you are trying to present yourself as the higher power party. But employing powerless or deferential language is a way of sort of positioning yourself as a lower power party within a given relationship. Now, there are a few different forms of differential language. Tag questions turn a statement into a question. So something like, "This classroom is too hot, don't you think?" You take your statement and then you transform it into a question. Disclaimers devalue statements by drawing attention to potential faults. So, "I could be wrong, but I think that." Question statements are statements that are spoken as questions. Now, this is kind of tricky. So you look at this and you could read it in two different ways. I could read it as, "The answer is assertiveness," right? And that implies that my statement is a statement. But if I changed my inflection and said something like, "The answer is assertiveness," I've effectively turned my statement into a question. Hesitations are things that convey different forms of uncertainty, or well. And these are kind of related to hedges, which help to protect against the risk of making a clear, direct statement. So things like, "Well, sort of," or "somewhat." A couple extra points I want to make about this idea of credibility. I think it's important to remember that the way in which this operates and the way in which we use our different conversational styles is highly contextualized, and it's important to be able to adapt to different situations. And the other thing I want to point out is that there are positive features of deferential language, and the textbook does point out some of these factors as well, because deferential language, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, where you'd actually consider it powerless or not, because it can also convey humility or respect for the other party, or it can be a more collaborative way of working together. So again, we've got our 3 points. Language allows us to construct and name our world. Language brings us together or separates us. And language conveys credibility to the user, in which case we're understanding it more as demonstrates and reinforces different power relationships. Barriers to effective verbal communication. This is sort of the most practical aspect of what we're talking about. These are the 10 barriers I'm going to talk about. The first 6 that are in black, these are the ones that are included in the course textbook. The last 4 in red are the ones that I'm going to be adding, and these will also be described in a handout that I will be posting on Nexus. The first is one of my favorite all-time words, BaffleGab. And BaffleGab is the use of unnecessarily long or complicated words and or jargon that other people do not understand. I find that this happens a lot when I go to academic conferences. Now, this doesn't mean that jargon is always a problem. Having a shared language code, right, can help to facilitate communication. So, for example, within your own academic discipline, there's different terms and theories that you would understand as a student of that discipline, right? And having those shared language codes helps you to communicate with other students who are in your same discipline. Equivocality is using words that have multiple interpretations. And again, when you have multiple interpretations, the potential for misunderstanding is much higher. So let's take the phrase, "I'll meet you outside after class." Well, what do you mean by that? Do you mean I'll meet you outside in the hallway? Or I will meet you outside of the building? Right? So you have to be careful with when you use words that have multiple possible interpretations. Now, sometimes though, you might use equivocality in an intentional and strategic way. So this is the idea of strategic ambiguity. And you'll often see this particularly within political discourse. And it's sort of a way of using often metaphor to prevent you from saying something too clearly. Because if you say it too clearly and you don't leave space for that ambiguity, you might lock yourself into a particular position. The use of metaphor can also help when communicating across cultures or across disciplines. Euphemisms are expressions that are meant to be less offensive or disturbing than the word or phrase it replaces. So, for example, you see your friend, and rather than saying, "You look awful," you say, "You look tired today." Or let's say a friend buys you, to go back to a case study from earlier in the term, buys you a painting and you think it's quite ugly. Instead, you say, "That painting is interesting." So this is sort of the way in which euphemism can be used to actually help save face and to protect other people too. Now, there's a particular form of euphemism, though, called doublespeak, and this is language that deliberately disguises the true meaning of an unpleasant or disturbing idea. And the idea here is that the underlying goal of doublespeak is deception. So these would be phrases like, the soldier was killed by friendly fire, or the potential for collateral damage is quite high when you use a nuclear bomb, right? So doublespeak is sort of a very negative aspect of what euphemisms can be. Language misuse is another potential barrier to verbal communication. This involves using a word in the wrong context, not following language conventions for that context, incorrect punctuation when you're writing, etc. So basically not following those four rules that govern the way language operates. So there are two potential dangers in this. One is obviously miscommunication, but also the potential that you will be discredited as a speaker. Static evaluation is the use of language that does not take the possibility or reality of change into account. So it's basically language that freezes something or someone in time. And you can usually identify static evaluation when you hear or see a statement that includes the words you are or I am, or things like it is, right? So if you have a parent that might say, oh, you're still my little baby, even though you're an adult, that would be a form of static evaluation. But as well as things like, you're a terrible student, right? This implies that terrible student is what you are and eliminates the possibility that you could change or that you have changed. We can also do it to ourselves in that if you say something like, I'm terrible at math, you're excluding the possibility that you could improve. And it isn't just for negative things, right? A phrase like, you're a fantastic writer, that's also static evaluation. The last barrier to effective verbal communication mentioned by the textbook is what is referred to as politically incorrect language, which I would suggest should be understood as language that dehumanizes or discriminates. And there's lots of different forms of this. There are several mentioned in the textbook, but just as two examples, language that isn't gender inclusive would be considered a form of politically incorrect language. So consider the difference between the term fireman versus the term firefighter. Another practice that I commonly see in elementary and secondary schools by both students and teachers is a tendency to refer to male teachers as sir and female teachers as miss, regardless of age or marital status or position of authority in schools. Now, the first of the four additional barriers that I want to add is abstraction. So basically, the higher the level of abstraction, the higher the potential is for miscommunication. So follow me along with this one. You need to have a better attitude. You need to be more positive. You need to complain less. You need to complain less about working hard. You need to stop complaining every time we have to work late or come in on weekends. So here we have 5 statements that are arranged from the most abstract to the most specific. Now, obviously, communicating the most abstract statement, that's the one where you're going to have the least likelihood of being able to communicate what you actually mean. So this is why I keep pushing this idea of trying to be very specific with our language, particularly when we're giving feedback to each other. For example, I've seen numerous iterations of these two types of comments on peer feedback forums. I've seen many people offer stuff like this. One, so-and-so should be more confident, or so-and-so should be more confident and talk more, right? Both of these are highly abstract statements. So what I'd encourage you to do now is just to pause the video for a second and think about how you could make either of these two abstract statements less abstract so as to better communicate your exact meaning. The second barrier that I want to add is how we go about using pronouns as well as the word but. So there's a couple of different terms to get across. It statements are statements that lets the speaker avoid taking responsibility for ownership of a message. I statements, wherein the speaker indicates ownership of a message. You statements, wherein you express judgment of another person. And we statements, which convey collective responsibility. And there's also but statements, and I'm going to introduce that one last. Okay, let's talk about it and I. So an it statement lets the speaker avoid taking responsibility for ownership of a message. So for example, consider the phrases, "it bothers me when you're late," versus "I'm worried when you're late," or "it's nice to see you," versus "I'm glad to see you." So by replacing the word I with it, you're kind of deferring and pushing away responsibility. You're distancing yourself from the message. It's very subtle, but it's interesting to listen for when people are talking. So again, we have to be careful when we use the word it and when we use the word I. Considering you statements and we statements. So a you statement implies judgment of another party, and a we statement implies some sense of collective responsibility. So let's consider the difference between "you left the kitchen a mess" and "we need to keep the kitchen cleaner." Now, you can also imply a you statement without actually using the word you. So a phrase like, "that was a stupid joke," that implies your jokes are stupid. So you're implying you, and it still conveys the same sense of judgment. And lastly, we have but statements, and this has to do with the way in which the word but can actually change the meaning of a sentence. Well, for example, let's say you get feedback on a paper that says, "you have great ideas, but your paper is poorly structured." Or, "I really like your cooking, but," or, "I'm not a racist, but." In each of these cases, but has the effect of canceling the thoughts that precede it. Now, this can mean that it often operates as a face-saving strategy that can protect either you or the other party, and is often used as a means for softening criticism. The next major barrier to verbal communication that I want to suggest is this idea of fact, inference, opinion, confusion. So I'm going to sort of throw a few terms out here. Factual statement. That's a statement that can be verified as true or false. So something like, "it's minus 27 degrees outside." An inferential statement is an interpretation of evidence. Something like, "it is very cold." An opinion statement is a belief or judgment that may or may not be based on evidence. "The weather is terrible." Fact, inference / opinion confusion is when you state an opinion as if it was a fact or inference. Now, usually we can identify these types of statements when they include the word is. So let's look at a few examples. Fact: "you haven't texted me or spoken to me in a week." Right? This is something that can be proved by evidence. Now, there's a couple of possible different inferences, a couple of different possible interpretations of that fact. "You are mad at me," or "you are busy." An opinion would be, "you are inconsiderate." Moving down, fact: "on average, winter temperatures in Winnipeg are 15 to 20 degrees Celsius colder than in Toronto." Two possible inferences or interpretations. One, folks in Toronto don't have to plug in their cars. Two, you are less likely to get frostbite in Toronto. An opinion would be, Toronto is better than Winnipeg. The last thing I want to talk about is emotive language. These are statements that seem to describe something, but actually convey how you feel about it, particularly if you approve or disapprove of a particular behavior. So let's say you approve of someone who doesn't like to spend a lot of money. Then you might say they're very thrifty. If you don't approve, you might say that they're very cheap. Or let's say you approve of someone who's very outspoken. Then you might say that they have a take-charge attitude. If you don't approve, you might say that they're bossy. And that's it for this week. This video provided a brief overview of several features of language that we can take into consideration when analyzing conflict in communication. For the quiz, you should be able to list and describe the characteristics of language, list and describe the social functions of language, and list and describe barriers to effective verbal communication.